I was thinking about how the ghetto was formed and how the disconnection of the intercity was created centuries ago. Now, you have many people in the urban community who don't have the same opportunities growing up as, their classmates or people from different cultures or nationalities. But if you think about it, the disconnect and the emasculation of man began centuries ago. Okay? And it slowly deteriorated the family dynamic in the city, predominantly amongst African Americans. Now, I still get torn upon African Americans and where the verbiage came from, apart from the biased judgment of the color of our skin and the fact that we were born in America. But before I get too far past it, it was that exactly what I just stated, the color of our skin and the fact that we were born in America, which actually sacrificed. And, for a long time, I was illiterate to the reality of sacrifice and what it actually meant. And a part of me believes that I didn't want to accept the fact that, my forefathers and my ancestors were sacrificed based upon the color of their skin. And if you go back to 1712, there was a syndrome written. And for many, they call it a prophecy. But I feel that it was propaganda. It was the beginning of the programming of the minds, where it separated brown kings from brown queens. It disconnected the family dynamic. It destroyed homes. It removed the father from the household to where he was able to raise his daughters and raise his sons in accordance with his visions and his perspective. For many of them, their visions were clouded because their vessels were calcified, okay? And not only was their vessels calcified from the poor diet, the lack of opportunity, the lack of education, it was calcified because their spirit was broken in front of their wives and children, ultimately destroying their soul. For many of them, their soul died long before they actually perished, okay? So if you go back to the syndrome, it created women to no longer look at the man for support, to look to the man to teach her. So I want to read y'all a quote. 1712, Willie Lynch prophesied this method of control that would push an inferior mentality on the enslaved and eliminate the strength and numbers that unity provided Africans in America. Lynch stated that the correct use of his methods would control these Africans in America for 300 years or more to come. So my perspective states that Africans that come from Africa are Africans in America, but Americans that are born in America are simply brown Americans. But neither here nor there. These actions were projected upon the brown community, beginning with the lynching of our forefathers and our ancestors. Now, when I say the lynching, if you think about it, years ago, and in some back country rural roads, a lot of times you hear it happen in the deep South, where people are still continuously being lynched. It's not happening as often today as it happened years ago. But I believe that it began the destruction of the family dynamic. You see, with the emasculation of the man, because if men were forced to become fearful, first of all, they weren't able to provide for their family. They weren't able to teach their family. Education was limited and controlled. Opportunity was also controlled. So without proper education and without the finances to provide and care for your family, that begins to break a man's soul. Now, I previously stated that we weren't designed to break. But if you look at society today, right, a lot of men, they have become so emasculated that there's many open discussions online stating how role reversal has become prominent in America. And a lot of the men are now traveling to third world countries to find wives because they want to bring back the original family dynamic where the man was the leader, where the woman felt safe to lean upon the man and take heed from his judgment. And, she felt comfortable with allowing him to teach her, and not only teach her, but to lead her as well as his children. So if you think about it, Willie Lynch created this syndrome, and I call it a syndrome because that's what it is. It's a disease. It's a disease of the mind. And when the seed was planted, it began to deteriorate at the willpower, at the strength of the man. You want to break a man down, the first thing you do is you attack his security. You attack his strength, and you attack his family. So if you break them down mentally and psychologically, now the woman, a lot of times the women will lose respect for the man because she will feel abandoned. You see? Because when you break the man down, the man tends to run away from himself. He's disconnected from his soul. His spirit is broken and his vessel is calcified, which means that he's operating out of a state of insanity. And, when you look at it from that perspective, that in the urban community, a lot of the men are currently insane. They're in a mental state of psychosis. But for many of them, they're operating in a programmed, high functional state of psychosis. So they may appear to be operating at a normal rate. And remember, normal falls under the level of control over your vessel and whether it's in alignment with the social behaviors that are being presented in front of us today. So when you think about how our forefathers and our ancestors were lynched, and this syndrome was planted within the urban community from Willie Lynch, it goes to show you, it takes us back to that, that crystal clear vision. And when that crystal clear vision began being poisoned, it removed the ability to nurture and heal the family from the woman. And it also removed the ability to provide and care for the family from the man. Now, when you get into the psychology of mankind, you realize that a lot of these steps to emasculate the man, if you want to destroy a nation, you attack the men. You don't attack the women, because remember, women, we are born to be vulnerable. We should be encouraged to feel safe in our vulnerability. You see where I'm going with this? Women, we're nurturers. We're also the strength of the household as well, because we hold that man up. We're the neck. If the man is the head of the household and the woman is the neck leads to the spine. Behind every strong man, they say, is a strong woman. And I don't mean, I personally don't prophesy that as saying that the woman should stand behind the man. Not at all. It's just behind the man is the back of his neck leads to his spine, right? And it's the spine that helps him stand up. It's the neck that affords him the strength to hold his head up when the world beats him down. But if you destroy the testosterone and you attack the masculinity of the man, that was the first step in destroying the urban community. And now this has trailed on for centuries now. Looking at where online it states that this syndrome was written in 1712, it's so deep that it goes in to say that the woman is not supposed to look to the man for support and to trust the man, and the man is no longer going to desire the woman. When I say that this was prophesied over 300 years ago, and today you see how a lot of the men of color, they don't desire women of color. And I'm not saying that we are supposed to solely date people from our culture, but there's some strength in that, because if you think about it, in other tribes and in other countries, they only date their own and reproduce with their own because it strengthens their bloodline, right? But if the brown community was under attack, there has to be an underlying message there, because we were taught to believe that we were weak. The underlying, because it's always a lie that's underneath the surface. The underlying is the lie that's buried under that surface there. We're taught to believe that we are weak because we don't have opportunity, or we're taught to believe that we are dumb because we don't quite understand the way of the world, which revolves around numbers. Now, when I think about the emasculation of man and the defeminization of women, it brings you to the absolute observation of society today, where a lot of the women, they aren't taught, they are not protected, they aren't encouraged. These principles and these morals, they aren't instilled in them from their youth, as well as growing up. Because it's not just in childhood. There are many children who have experienced adverse situations who were still able to navigate and rejoin and align their spirit with their soul, adapting their authenticity of who they are at their core, which is gods, goddesses. But if the emasculation started with our forefathers centuries ago, that means that it was passed down to us. I say that it was passed down for centuries. I mean in the practices, right? And the way that we raise our families and the way that we teach our families. It's passed down in the communities that we exist in. and the way that we speak over our offspring, our children, because our offspring is our children. A reproduction factor is the reproduction, the clones of who we are. If we began molding and shaping our children in our womb, right? Because the child is shaped and formed in the womb of the mother. Now, although I believe that the Most High distribute the soul, we began pouring into that child from the moment of conception. So after conception, everything that this child is exposed to, it revolves a cycle of broken homes, because a lot of the women, they have children out of wedlock. They're not taught the importance of marriage and, goal planning and before giving birth to a child. And ultimately, the women become dependent upon the government, and the man becomes a slave of the government, because a lot of them become incarcerated. And if they're not physically incarcerated, they're mentally incarcerated, because you don't have to be in prison to be serving time. Okay? So if you think about the reality that our minds are imprisoned from the moment after conception, because often our parents are taught from their parents to reject their self. And these behaviors are mirrored by us. Now, whether we are raised in a broken home, or a single parent dynamic, whether we are raised by our aunts, our uncles, our grandparents, or even in adoption, these wounds are still present, because the child wants to know and they yearn for their natural family. We are not able to speak freely about the things that are presented in front of us. We have to consider, well, what if someone's sexual orientation is this or that? And to be honest, I don't care what a person's sexual orientation is. What I do notice, though, is the fact that society, for centuries, have emasculated the man to the point where you can look into the eyes, because the eyes is the window to the soul. And, seers, they say seers are the gift of discernment, and prophets, and, they have the ability to see the soul, and they see into the windows of the soul. But looking into the eyes of man, you can see the deterioration of their soul. And it would take a very broad vision to realize that the deterioration of the souls, it didn't begin overnight. It didn't begin in my generation. And, it's been going on for centuries. And a lot of times these different forms of religion, I believe that they were fed to us as a false wind. And when I say that it was fed to us as a false wind, I believe that we were given, these forms of literature to consume for hope and for faith, because the path in front of us was destined to be disastrous. We wasn't given the books and the literature that would strengthen our dynamic and that would teach us the difference between wealth and money and liquid assets versus assets, and the difference between the two, and how to convert money, which is paper currency, into wealth. So, when I look back at the Lynch syndrome, I realized that, this has been going on for centuries. And at the point that we've arrived at today in society, it's going to take a lot of waking up for mankind to realize that we are at war. And, we can become blinded by the many wars that's going on around us, in different areas of the world and on television. But we are truly at war for our core. We're at war for our soul. We are at war for our morality, for our dignity, for our principles, for our femininity, for our masculinity. The very things that we should not have to fight for, those things are under attack. And, I often wonder, what steps would we need to take, and in what direction should we move into when the societal norms are solely wrapped around keeping our minds in this state of bondage. But with the vessel being at a high level of calcification, soul is in bondage, the spirit is broken, the vessel is calcified, reaching the minds of the people, it seems so far-fetched that, it makes it hard to process the reality of the current state of society. So let me know y'all thoughts on this topic, and I'm going to chime in with y'all later. Peace.